All right, who is really super awesome at forgiveness? Nobody, right? Does forgiveness come really easily to? No? Okay, so I'm not the only one that struggles with forgiveness? Okay, I struggle with forgiveness. Forgiveness, I just find, it's hard. It is really hard to forgive. One of the times it was hardest for me was about a decade ago, 2012. I was just getting done with my graduate degree, so I was looking, all these jobs across the country, and I had a few opportunities, and I found a job just down the street, and I was like, oh, this is going to be awesome. I was so excited, and the boss had told me, okay, this is going to kind of be where you start, and the organization is this size, and we're growing at this rate, and this is how your salary will grow depending on that. And I was like, yeah. So I get in, and I start, and within like a couple weeks, I'm like, you are a liar. None of what you said is true. And I was realizing that I was going to be working for free forever because of what he had told me, and that it just wasn't true. And so just a few weeks into this job, I call him up, and I'm like, hey, we got to meet. He's like, oh, yeah, we can next. I'm like, we got to meet now. And so we go to the office, and he comes in with his baseball cap down over his eyes. One of those things where he knew he had done something wrong, but he didn't want to say it. And we have like the world's most awkward conversation, and it was just really hard. So I tell him I quit. I walk away from it. I get home, and the next few days I'm like, okay, I'm a Christian. So as a follower of Jesus, I need to forgive him. So I would sit there. Have you ever done this? You like sit there and you're like, God, I forgive this person. And your heart's like, no, you don't. Right? Have you ever done that? Like, oh, I forgive him. No, you really don't. And I knew I hadn't. And it was like, but I want to, but I can't. But I want to, but my heart won't do it. And then it got harder. Because this was right at the end of the recession. And so there weren't a lot of other jobs, and I started calling back those opportunities that I had turned down when I took this one, and they had been filled. And so I was unemployed for a year. I started picking up odd jobs here and there, got back into construction that I had done here and there before that, and I really struggled with some self-doubt and some frustration of being unemployed, and it all went back to one guy not telling me the truth. And I really profoundly struggled to forgive him. It took me that whole next year to really feel like I had forgiven him. Like when I said, I forgive him, my heart went, okay, I think it took like a year. Forgiveness is so hard. Forgiveness is so hard. And I think I'm probably not alone that forgiveness just doesn't come naturally to us. It's so hard to forgive. Forgiveness is the releasing of your right to be offended and frustrated and hold a grudge and a debt over someone else. And it's a challenge. Forgiveness is a huge, huge challenge. And we all need to learn how to forgive because we've all been wronged. And guess what? We're all going to be wronged. And so we have to be able to forgive. But it's such a challenge. They did a study and they found that 88% of people recognize that forgiveness in your life is absolutely necessary, and yet most of those people said that really there isn't forgiveness in the world. And so we know we need to do it, and yet we are unable to forgive, which is bad because a study by Johns Hopkins found that unforgiveness raises your rates of everything from cholesterol to blood pressure to depression to anxiety. Like unforgiveness is crippling. And so how do we know this difference? How do we learn this difference between unforgiveness and forgiveness? It's so stinking hard. Well, Jesus told this amazing story about an unforgiving servant to teach us about forgiveness. It's an amazing story, and we're going to be reading this today. You can turn to Matthew chapter 18. We're going to start in verse 21 if you have your Bible with you. If you don't, words will be up on the screen. How do we forgive? Why do we forgive? Here's how this story begins. Matthew 18, verse 21. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Now, the funny part about this language is he says brother, and his own brother, Andrew, was like sitting right there, which kind of makes this a little bit awkward. But also, this is funny because, you see, at that time, religious leaders, they would teach the people in Israel that you need to forgive people 3 times. That if someone hurts you, forgive them 3 times, or be willing to keep forgiving someone 3 times. And Peter's like, should I go beyond that? Should I do better than that? Should I forgive 7 times? And it's possible that Peter was thinking back to Leviticus 16, where in the law of the sacrifice, the priest would sprinkle the blood of the bull 7 times in the temple to forgive the people of Israel from their sins. And so he's trying to figure out, like, okay, Jesus, how do you say we forgive people? Is it 3? Is it 7? How many times do I forgive? 22. Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Now, Jesus isn't saying, like, go and say, I forgive someone 77 times, right? He's not like, okay, say, I forgive. Oh, I missed one. I forgive. Right? Like, you're not counting 70. He's saying it's endless. It's not 3, it's not 7. You just forgive. Peter's question is a how question, and we all struggle with forgiveness. Like, how do you actually forgive? How do you make it real? How do you forgive someone? I'm very curious in this because it's something that I think everyone struggles with, including myself. And so I've been reading psychology journals, like these articles of how do you forgive someone? And they're titled with things like bear the pain and let go, which to me is just words. Like, it's just mumbo jumbo. Like, how does that help me learn how to forgive? I can't figure it out. It's completely unhelpful. And so maybe how is the wrong first question to ask. The better first question is why. Not how do you forgive, that's later, but why do you forgive? Why do you forgive? Why should we forgive? So what Jesus is going to do, he's going to tell us a story. He's not going to tell you how to forgive. Not the 20-point plan of, well, here's how you do it. No, he's going to say, here's why you forgive. Here's why you forgive. And he's going to tell this story. And we've been looking at these different stories Jesus told about the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. And here's another one. He says this in verse 23. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. So, the king wants to clear up some debts, figure out who owes him what, and so he calls this man to court. Now, we're going to call this guy Albert so we remember who he is. Why Albert? No idea. I think I saw a TV show with a guy named Albert on it last week. We're just going to call him Albert for fun so we remember his name. But in today's money, Albert owes the king about $9.6 billion. Not million with an M, billion with a B, right? $9.6 billion. It would take 10,000 soldiers to carry this much gold that he had become indebted to the king. Now, for a servant, for an employee of the king, I don't know about you, but I've never been entrusted by an employer with $9.6 billion before, right? So he's probably the treasurer. He's like a high up servant of the king. He's probably the treasurer. He's been in this important position. And you don't misplace like $9.6 billion worth of gold. You don't misplace millions of pounds of gold. This was probably intentional. My guess, my assumption here is that he was stealing from the king. That he's actually betrayed the king's trust as one of his trusted servants. So Albert, old Al, he's probably been secretly stealing millions of pounds of gold. Big trouble, right? Verse 25. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. So there was no bankruptcy law in the first century. Like, you couldn't just be Michael Scott and go, I declare bankruptcy, and then all your debt is gone, right? You paid back a debt. If you had a debt that you were never going to be able to repay, there was a few Office fans. All right. If you had a debt you could never repay, what you had to do is sell yourself into slavery to pay back the debt, or be imprisoned, go to debtor's prison to pay back the debt, and sometimes your family got enslaved too. Some terrible, terrible stuff. That was the norm, and Albert and his family are going to go that direction the rest of their lives. And if you're not picking up on what the characters in this story represent so far, because I know these stories can be a little confusing at times. The king represents God, and we are represented by Albert, the guy with the $9.6 billion debt to the king. How does that make sense? Well, all the messed up stuff we've ever done, it doesn't just hurt ourselves, it doesn't just hurt God, it doesn't just hurt others, it's put us in debt to God. And so we owe a debt we can never repay. We owe this debt to God, a debt we deserve to be enslaved to, a debt we deserve to be imprisoned to forever, a debt that no matter how good of a person you think you are, a debt no matter how many old ladies you walk across the road, you cannot pay back. It's impossible. Verse 26. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. "Be patient with me," he begged, "and I'll pay back everything." Can Albert pay back everything? No, it's impossible. It's impossible. But, verse 27, the servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. I mean, the king's forgiveness is stunning here. And the king, who has to come up with this $9.6 billion? Who loses it? It's the king, right? The king pays out of his own treasury. I owe God more than I could ever repay, but in sending Jesus to the cross, God paid my debt from his own treasury by becoming one of us and dying for us. My only hope is to simply fall before God. Not to say, as Albert says, "Oh, I can pay everything back," but to simply fall on the grace of my king. That's it. That's my only, one and only hope. Now, you'd wish this would be the end of the story, but it's not. Unfortunately, it's not the end of the story for old Albert, and now we're going to discover why unforgiveness is so imprisoning. Albert is going to do something that is like what we do, and we're going to discover a lot about why we should forgive and why unforgiveness is so imprisoning to our souls. So here's what Albert does now that he's been forgiven. Verse 28. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. Now, 100 silver coins is nothing compared to what Albert was just forgiven of. It's about $12,000. But $12,000 is still something. Like, that's a ton to me, right? So it's not $9.6 billion, but $12,000 is something. And it's interesting Jesus included this because to forgive, we first have to name the offense, not sweep it under the rug. You cannot forgive what you refuse to acknowledge. And so we're hoping, what do we hope in this story? That Albert's like, "Oh, well, I was just forgiven $9.6 billion. I forgive you of the $12,000. But that's not what happens. He grabbed him, keep going, 28 here. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Now, Albert's anger is controlling him so much. His unforgiveness is controlling his mind so much that when he just sees this guy who owes him the $12,000 debt, when he just sees him, he runs over and he goes all WWE on him, right? He's like got a chokehold on this guy. His unforgiveness has imprisoned him to anger. This is the first reason why we must forgive, the why behind forgiveness. Unforgiveness imprisons our minds. It imprisons our minds, doesn't it? Do you ever remember the first time you used a DVR? You know, like a TV DVR? DVRs are kind of how our brain works a little bit. Like I remember I was a 90s kid, so when you wanted to watch TV, you had to sit, this is going to sound weird to some of you. You had to sit in front of your TV at a certain time, right? And then a show would play, and you couldn't fast forward through the commercials. Like, it was crazy. And so years ago, I remember the first time I used a DVR, we were at my wife's uncle's house, and he hands me the remote. And I'm like, "You can fast forward TV? What?" And so we were watching a football game, and I'm a little obsessed with football, so I could rewind and watch a play again and try to figure out who was doing what. I could fast forward through all the bad commentary and all the commercials and all that. And I was like, "This is awesome. You can fast forward and rewind and pause and rewatch." And it was really cool until he took the remote from me because I was giving everyone TV whiplash, right? I was a very irresponsible DVR controller. My wife might tell you I still am. But it's a bit how our mind works. That you can, in our mind's eye, our memories work a little bit like a DVR. We recall memories that we've stored up in our minds, and you can re-watch them in our mind's eye. The problem then when unforgiveness is it's like giving someone else the DVR remote control to your mind. It forces you to keep watching that scene where you were hurt over and over and over again, and you can't get it out. It's like someone else keeps pressing rewind, play, rewind, play. Do you know what I'm talking about? It just kind of keeps going. You can't control it. If you don't forgive, the more you watch, the angrier you get. And ultimately, your mind becomes imprisoned to watching that memory over and over and over again. Unforgiveness imprisons our mind. And as you watch it over and over again, that anger and that frustration, it just gets a hold of you. It imprisons your mind. Unforgiveness is letting someone just live rent-free in your brain. It's been said that unforgiveness is like me drinking poison and hoping that the person who hurt me will die. It imprisons you. It hurts you. But we get used to the poison. So many of us, we don't forgive others because we've gotten too used to our identity being rooted in victimhood. Many of us don't forgive because, we don't want to do the hard work of looking at our wounds and healing. It's much easier just to stay angry. Many of us don't forgive because, we get a poisonous, odd pleasure out of living in the past. Unforgiveness imprisons our minds. This is one of the reasons why we forgive. Okay, verse 28. Pay back what you owe me. So you got Albert on the street WWEing this guy that owes him $12,000, right? And he says, pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me, and I'll pay it back. Now, Jesus was a brilliant storyteller. And so he nearly mirrors the language of Albert from earlier in verse 26 when Albert is pleading with the king to here in verse 28 and 29 when the fellow servant is pleading with Albert. But somehow, Albert is missing how much greater his debt was than this man's. And so do we. We want to believe that other people's offenses against us are so much greater than our offenses against God, but there's no comparison. Albert owed $9.6 billion. This other guy owed $12,000. And this is Jesus' way of saying, hey, quit making this comparison. Like Jesus said, everything you've done wrong in your life has been an offense and a rebellion and betrayal to God. When you've wronged someone else, it's just one thing. When they've wronged you, it's just one thing. Verse 30. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. Now, raise your hand if you have ever lent anyone money. Have you ever lent anybody money? All right, keep your hand raised if you would lend somebody $12,000 who's a total and utter stranger you've never met before. Right? Okay. Because I was going to talk to whoever had their hand raised after the service. No. So, $12,000. If you're going to lend $12,000 to someone, that means that you know them. Yeah? Right? If Albert lent $12,000, that means that this guy is his friend. And yet, even with this close relationship with this other person, he throws him into prison, which was just the same exact thing that he got out of. The same exact threat that he was forgiven of. Same thing. Even with this person he has this friendship relationship with. And this is the second reason that why we forgive. It's because unforgiveness imprisons relationships. Now, there's a few types of relationships that always call for forgiveness. And the first type is when you're going to continue in this relationship after the forgiveness takes place, right? We have to forgive our spouses, our children, our parents, our close friends, the people we go to church with. To have a job, to be in a family, to be in a church means you are going to be forgiving. You have to forgive people constantly. But here's what happens if we don't. So in high school, I got a really bad back injury, and they were trying to figure out what was going on. And so for some months, every week, they took me to an acupuncturist. No high schooler wants this, right? I don't know whose idea it was. So they took me to an acupuncturist, the guys who put the needles in you. And these needles were comically long. They were so unnecessarily long. And so the first few weeks, I remember this guy I'd be laying on my stomach, and he'd start putting these needles into my back and in my legs, which I still don't understand. My legs were just fine. And I remember when it would go into my back, I'd flinch, right? Because it's needle. So that little flinch. You know what I'm talking about when you just got hurt, something like that? You just felt pain. So I felt pain, and then I flinch. But over the weeks, what happened is I caught myself flinching before the needle went in. So it became reversed. I started to flinch before I felt the pain. And that's like what happens if we don't forgive in our close relationships. We become defensive. We start to flinch before the pain. And you can't live in close relationships like that because it tears that relationship apart. If you're just expecting the next time for them to hurt you because you've never forgiven them, if you're just waiting on them to do the next thing because you've never forgiven them, you're going to start to flinch. You're going to get defensive, and walls are going to go up in that relationship. So unforgiveness, what it does is it imprisons our close relationships, and we have to be able to forgive. The other situation, though, is when after the forgiveness, you're not going to have that relationship, right? Maybe it's someone you never really knew close anyway. Maybe it's someone who doesn't really want to be involved in your life. Or maybe it's someone that, and this is perfectly healthy at times, someone who you've said, you know what? I'm going to have to make sure that my family and myself, it'd just be unwise to allow this person access in my life anymore. This is when forgiveness gets hard, when you're going to forgive, but the relationship's no longer going to be there. You know those old cartoons with the prisoner, and then there would be like a ball and chain around their ankle, right? That's unforgiveness. Unforgiveness tethers you back to the person who hurt you, even if they're not even a part of your life anymore. It tethers you to them. And there's such a weight, like a big ball, there's such a weight that it takes to constantly do the work of dehumanizing someone and seeing them only as the villain in your story. Like it takes a lot out of you. There's a weight on you not to forgive. But forgiveness in these situations is saying, I don't want to hold myself captive to this. God can heal me. God will heal me of this wound. And I don't need anything else from you. This forgiveness means you've decided the other person doesn't owe you a thing. Not an explanation, not a repayment, not an apology. It means you have canceled the debt. You have seen them as human. And now you're able to move on. Why forgive? Because unforgiveness imprisons our relationships. It creates a defensiveness and walls and flinching in close relationships, and it tethers us to people who we no longer have relationships with. Unforgiveness imprisons our relationships. Verse 31, when the other servants saw what had happened, so there's some other people watching like, oh, wow, that dude's choking that guy, right? When the other servants saw what happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant. You wicked servant, he said. I canceled all of that debt because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In his anger, the master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed, which he couldn't, right? So remember, it's impossible for Albert to pay back this debt. He's going to be there for eternity. And in the Greek, this word for jailer means someone who inflicts pain as punishment. And so it likely represents Satan, and this prison likely represents hell, the eternal prison of our soul. So this is the third reason why we forgive. Unforgiveness imprisons our soul. Verse 35 says, this is how my heavenly Father will treat you. So now Jesus has told the story, and now he's going to give a little commentary. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. Unforgiveness imprisons our soul. If we live a life where we just never forgive anybody, we're in danger of spending eternity separated from God. Now, how does that work? Right? Because we believe in a faith of grace, not works. So how does that work? Well, it's not that by doing the work of forgiving someone else that God goes, oh, you earned my forgiveness. That's the opposite of what we believe, right? Instead, we reveal if our faith in God is genuine by forgiving. An unforgiving heart reveals an unforgiven heart, because an unforgiving heart reveals you never understood the debt you owed God and the great sacrifice he made to forgive you of it. It is not possible to see the debt God has paid for me and still hold all of my debts against other people. The stamp of genuine faith is being forgiving, right? The stamp of having a real faith, a saving faith, a genuine faith is being forgiving. So imagine, I'll explain it like this. Imagine you go to the mall and you're going to buy a diamond ring, right? And then on the way out, they package it up for you, and there's that little box, and there's a little gold stamp on the outside that says genuine diamond. Now, does that stamp make it real? No. You could put a little Cracker Jack ring in there, and it would not be a real diamond. But that little stamp is the best way that you know whether it's a genuine diamond or not, unless you're a diamond expert, which I'm not. I'm going to guess you're not either. Same thing with faith. Forgiving others does not save us. There's nothing you can do to save yourself. It is by grace alone. Instead, forgiveness, though, is one of the stamps that reveals whether my faith is genuine. And it takes faith to embrace the cross and the sacrifice of Christ and to be forgiven. So why forgive? Well, because unforgiveness imprisons our soul. So back to Peter's question. Back to the question we so often ask. How do you forgive? Well, what's revealed in this story is that the first question, the more important question is, why do you forgive? Before you get to the 21 steps of how to forgive, you got to know why you forgive. Why do we forgive? Well, it's because forgiveness is freedom. The reason we forgive is not about whether the other person deserves it, has earned it back, has apologized. No, the reason we forgive is because what others have done to me, what others have done to me is nothing compared to what Jesus has done for me. Jesus has paid to set me free. Jesus gave his life to set me free, to forgive me from my debt, and to set me free. Jesus did that for me. So why in the world will I ever imprison others to my unforgiveness? If I understand the forgiveness and freedom Jesus has given me, why would I hold that back from others? And why in the world, if Jesus has forgiven me and set me free, would I imprison my own soul, my own mind to unforgiveness? Forgiveness is freedom. Imagine it like this. Imagine if tomorrow morning you get a knock on your door. And you go outside, you open your door, and there's two policemen there, and they're like, we're here to arrest you. You have the right to remain silent. You're like, what? You got the wrong person, man. What are you talking about? And they're like, no, this is you. So you're taken to court, and you get up in front of the judge in the courtroom, and the judge begins to play a video of every wrong thing you've ever done, said, or thought. I'd have a very long video, right? So this video starts to play. It starts to play, and it plays, and it plays. And at first, you're like, dude, I don't deserve to go to jail. What are you talking about? But as you watch the video, you're like, oh, okay, I get it. So by the time the judge pronounces the judgment and says, life in prison, you're not happy about it, but you can wrap your mind around it. So they whisk you off to prison, and you're sitting there in the jail cell, just the weight of your own sin. You just watched all of your sin, all of your wrongs that you've ever done, and the weight of that is heavy on you. When you can finally start to fall asleep and close your eyes in the middle of the night, just as you close your eyes, you hear the prison door open. And you look up, and your eyes are adjusting, and you see that it's the judge, and the judge is in your cell. He says, what are you doing here? And he just says, quick, we don't have much time. So before you know it, you've exchanged clothes, and now the judge is standing in the prison cell, and he's wearing your orange prisoner onesie, and you're wearing his suit and his robes, and you're like, what are you doing? And he says, well, I'm taking your place. I wanted to forgive you, but someone has to pay the price. Somebody has to pay the debt. Somebody has to pay off the wrong for you. So I will pay the price that you deserve so I can set you free. And as it sinks in on what's about to happen, you're like, I can't believe this. What can I do? The judge's like, you don't have to do anything, but guess what? When you go and live your life, and now you've got your life back, you've got freedom back. And as you go and live your life, here's what you have to do. Just forgive people. Like, when they wrong you, remember this day when I paid with my life to forgive you, and know that there's nothing that anyone can do to you that is bigger than what I'm doing for you right now. So as you move through your life, forgive. So the judge takes your place, and he lies down in the bed, and you walk out of the jail cell, and you are free. How would you live the rest of your life? When somebody cheated you, lied to you, stole from you, wronged you, offended you, said that thing to you, didn't follow through for you, what would you do? You have to forgive. You'd forgive. You'd have to forgive. When someone hurts you, you forgive. It'd have nothing to do with whether they deserved it, but it would have everything to do with that day in the jail cell and what was done for you. Jesus has forgiven. Jesus is like the judge. He's walked into the prison cell for you, taken your place, died in your place, given his life in your place to set you free. And that forgiveness is freedom. So why would we imprison ourselves through unforgiveness? Why forgive? Because forgiveness is freedom. That's this story. This amazing story of this unforgiving servant is all about this, that I am forgiving because I'm forgiven. I'm forgiving because I'm forgiven. Look, I get it. Like we've all been wounded thousands of times through life. We've all been hurt. And you know what? It's going to happen this week again. Someone's going to offend you, hurt your feelings, do something you wish hadn't. And I get it. We all struggle with forgiveness, and we've all got this like list of stuff people have done to us. This list of just stuff that we've been hurt by. You've got that family member who's wronged you over and over and over again. Like, what do I do with this? You've got that boss who's stolen your time and it takes you for granted and says that, what do I do with this? We've all got this list. I've got one. You've got one. What do you do with this? Well, you forgive. And it's not about that person repaying you. It's not about them apologizing. That's not the why. No, the why is this. I'm forgiving because I am forgiven. That's why we forgive. That's why we forgive. See, pop psychology will tell you, well, you want to be forgiving because it will make you happy. And common sense will tell you, you want to be forgiving just because you need to move on in life, right? The enemy will tell you, oh, actually, don't be forgiving. You want to get revenge. But none of those are true. No, the reason I'm forgiving is because I'm forgiven. I'm forgiven. The cost we pay to forgive others can never and will never compare to the cost that Jesus has given us. It's $9.6 billion to $12,000. It doesn't compare. Jesus has set you free. He has forgiven you on the cross. So do not imprison yourself to unforgiveness. I am forgiving because I'm forgiven.